My name is Edward Harper and I'm from Berea, Ohio. I am currently an MBA student at Tiffin University, and this video is about player compensation for student athletes in the NCAA. I will touch on the topics of a marketing-based approach to compensation, an NCAA proposal for player compensation, and labor laws and taxation effects on potential legislations. Lastly, I will give a recommendation for student-athlete compensation with other benefits involved. In a market-based approach, the value of an asset can be determined by the comparison of the market price of similar items that have been recently sold. This is an important aspect of a free market economy. Currently, in the NCAA, member institutions determine the value of players, but in terms of scholarships. This creates issues because scholarships at some institutions have greater implicit rewards, which therefore does not create a free market because a player's value can fluctuate at different universities. Compensating athletes would create a free market system. These potential student-athlete payments would be signified by their talents in comparison to other players on the market. This approach also encourages a healthy competitive environment, as institutions would have less need and capacity for the highest quality players. The compensation idea would encourage the best institutional fit for the athlete, not purely the amount of money that they would receive. Markets are so different, so players would be able to chase more fruitful markets or untapped markets, which could grow the visibility of the NCAA, the player, and the university they attend. This also makes individual players more valuable to a team and to a university, so higher standards would be required by all three parties. Lastly, according to Joe Nocera of the New York Times, player compensation would be more expensive for institutions, but the price wouldn't be overly expensive, and it would also create a more beneficial environment for the student athletes. In 2013, the president of the NCAA, Mark Emmert, made a proposal to compensate student athletes. According to Jeremy Fowler of CBS Sports, the proposal was to provide a stipend of at least $2,000 to cover extra expenses that aren't covered by traditional scholarships. These expenses became one of the most important and original issues in regard to the amateurism debates of the NCAA student athletes. The proposal was ultimately voted down by the member institutions of the NCAA, but they did gain an insight on the thoughts behind the new legislation. There was interest in a need-based stipend, which would assist athletes to cover expenses that they could not afford. The stipend would also be categorized as financial aid, and applications would be through the Free Application for Federal Student Aid, or FAFSA. Potential compensation for student athletes could create new legal ramifications and cause a mass change throughout the league. One important question that needs to be answered is, do athletes count as employees? In an excerpt from Sports Law as a reflection of society's laws and values, Pay for Play for College Athletes, Peter Gopalrun III writes, "The National Labor Relations Act gives employees of businesses engaging in interstate commerce the right to organize and engage in concerted activity for the purpose of collective bargaining or other mutual aid." With that said, NCAA athletes do actually engage in interstate commerce as the product is moved from state to state, which takes money throughout different states in the entire country. But does that mean that athletes become employees? The interpretation of employee in this scenario determines the labor law impact that will affect the legislation. Student athletes, like graduate assistants, already receive benefits similar to normal work employees. They receive education and other benefits along with a scholarship. Graduate assistants also receive workers' compensation and trigger tax consequences for their stipend. Does this make a case for athletes being employees? Quite possibly. A stipend can be viewed as a payment for services rendered, which would be a formal payment for their participation. These labor laws likely point to student athletes to be employees just as graduate assistants are. This allows student athletes to potentially reap other benefits outside of their tuition reimbursement. The labor law issues also feed into taxation issues for student athletes. The way it sits now, current athletic scholarships are untaxable. This means that scholarships are free money which do not have any other fees associated from the government. It is important to know that they are untaxed because that means student athletes are benefiting greater from a value by not receiving a stipend over an athletic scholarship. For graduate assistants, when a stipend is given to them, part of the scholarship becomes taxable income. Because money is received due to services rendered, the government is able to place a tax on the money received. This is a negative for student athletes because this means that less money will be received and used rather than getting paid it in tuition. It also adds a burden of tax withholdings for Social Security and Medicare. For the reasoning of using the stipend to pay for necessary expenses, much of the money will be taken away for taxation purposes. This would affect the environment that the student athletes are creating because it could create unhealthy living situations for athletes. Just like labor laws, NCAA regulations would be forced to change. Would these institutions put athletes in a position to lose money or overwork them since they are technically employees? Possibly. And so the NCAA would have to step up to ensure fair treatment. These issues, if not handled by the NCAA, could cause a player union to form, which would just be more money taken out of their stipends. The taxation implication would affect all parties involved. It could also add an impact on evaluation of unrelated business income for NCAA member institutions. Though employees would benefit from being paid, it would be the NCAA's job to stop further exploitation of student athletes. My proposal for compensation of student athletes is simple. The proposal involves creating a scholarship cap for all NCAA Division I members. In this scholarship cap, a player can receive a full or partial scholarship or receive a payment for the exact amount. All NCAA scholarships would be the same amount of money, and whatever price was left over would be handled by the school in return for the payment of the student's tuition by the NCAA. This is a positive for student athletes because this gives them an opportunity to use the money right away, but at a lower value, or use it to replace student loans after college, which would be untaxable and without interest after the loans are due for repayment. The NCAA would benefit because it solves some of the competitive balance issues that are present in the NCAA today. An athlete can be offered more money at a less prominent school, or he can be offered less money at a big-time school. The NCAA can still limit the receiving of gifts, but making legislation that all payments must be made through the NCAA to preserve competitive balance and prevent athletic boosters from influencing potential recruits. A part of this rule, athletes receiving money would have to be a part of the athletic program for 2 seasons before becoming a quote-unquote free agent. The idea of a free agency restricts schools from stockpiling talent and allowing players to move on to better situations for their careers at their own risk. Players would still be restricted from profiting off their likeness without prior approval from the NCAA. This is a competitive balance regulation to stop big markets from stealing high-quality players. This new legislation can also benefit the institutions. A more fair revenue sharing system helps keep teams even in competition. Small schools will stay profitable to help attract athletes with renovations, while larger schools can focus on the opportunities within their own market. This would also prevent dynasties from forming in the NCAA. The recent success of teams like Alabama football or historical success of UCLA or Duke basketball will be issues of the past. Putting these legislations together will create greater opportunities for all players. These teams will face more issues with recruiting, as money is a great motivator. Small schools can offer more for certain players and take recruits away from larger schools to create a more balanced playing field for all members of the NCAA.